a major property boom is set to begin in a few weeks in Australia. Now, that statement has probably triggered you in one of two ways. Firstly, you may be thinking, oh, come on, Nero, what property boom? Don't you know that interest rates are at the highest they've ever been in for over a decade? Don't you know that unaffordability right now is at record highs? Fewer and fewer Australians can afford a property. And don't you know that more and more people are in mortgage stress? All these factors might be true, but they won't stop the property boom, as I'm about to explain. Or secondly, you might be thinking, Nero, property boom starts. Don't you know what's been happening to properties in my local area? They've already risen so much, right? That is also true. So regardless of where you sit, into this video, I'm going to bring both schools of thought together and show you why I'm so confident that a property boom is just a few weeks away. So if that's what you're interested in, stay tuned. Hi, it's Nero here, and 2023 has been a very strange year. We started off the year with headlines talking about how much the property market was going to crash. Okay, we saw predictions of 20% and above. But what's actually happened to the property market? Well, have a look at this chart. Here we have data from CoreLogic and Macro Business as of the 31st of October 2023. And what we can see here is that property prices hit a low at the end of January, and then they've increased quite considerably. Sydney, for example, is up 11.5%. Now that's already a boom, because remember, a booming market is a market that gets 10% or more annual capital growth. Sydney's well and truly exceeded that. Melbourne, struggling, still the weakest of our capital cities, and a market that I think will still continue to struggle for a while, but still 4.8% capital growth. No crash there either. Brisbane property prices over 10% growth this year. Adelaide 7.2%, Perth 10%. In fact, on average, our 5 biggest capital cities have grown by 9.2%. And if you look through the data throughout Australia, property prices are up on average about 8%. Yes, some areas more, some areas less. So if we've already had such substantial capital growth in multiple markets around the country, why am I then saying the property boom is only about to begin? Well, there are a number of reasons. Let me explain. First of all, if we look at this chart, the Home Value Index from CoreLogic, and we look at Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, we can see that for the last 3 months to the 31st of October, they've all had substantial growth. In fact, if we annualize those growth levels, we will see over 10% growth in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. And I really believe that's on the cards to happen. So although you are seeing reports in the media about the slowdown in capital growth, again, that's very Sydney and Melbourne specific. And you can see that here because Sydney's had 2.5% growth for the last quarter. Mind you, annualize, that's still 10% growth, but I think that's going to slow slightly only because Sydney was the market that led the property price recovery. It started its new growth phase first. It exploded because of the shortage of listings, and now it's starting to slow down, take a bit of a breather before I believe it goes again. Melbourne is still struggling for a whole variety of reasons, but don't be put off when you see media reports that are focused and very heavily Sydney and Melbourne centric. That's not the case for the entire country. There are definitely many areas around Australia, like I just mentioned, 3 of our smaller capital cities, plus multiple regional markets that are growing at an accelerated rate compared to just a few months ago. And if we look at the data from last month from CoreLogic, we can see this reflected in the various growth figures. So having a look at this chart from CoreLogic, what we can see is that last month, property prices in Sydney grew 0.8%. In Melbourne, 0.5%. This reflects the slowdown that I showed you in the previous chart. But then look at Brisbane, 1.4%. Okay, now annualized, that becomes over 16% capital growth over the next 12 months, if that's set to continue. Adelaide, 1.3%. Perth, 1.6%. These are big growth figures. Reason number 2, the number of distressed sales are actually falling. I mean, remember the talk at the beginning of this year about the fixed rate mortgage cliff? I mean, what happened to that? There was so much talk in the media about how people who are rolling off those low fixed rate loans were going to have to default on their mortgages, properties were going to flood the market and people were going to be able to get properties at an absolute bargain. But that hasn't eventuated. In fact, have a look at this chart. Here you can see the proportion of distressed listings across every one of our capital cities from Domain. And the clear takeaway message is, if you look at the end, the lines are going down. The proportion of distressed sales are actually decreasing after hitting a peak at the start of this year. So it shows that even though we have had multiple interest rate rises already this year, we're not seeing as many distressed sales. So the fixed rate mortgage cliff is not going to impact the market at all. We're already well and truly halfway through that sort of fixed rate mortgage cliff, so halfway through the number of people rolling off those cheap fixed rates onto higher variable rates, and we are not seeing that impact that so many people were trying to scare you about. Reason number 3. There are a low number of properties for sale. In fact, if we look at the number of properties listed on the market in September, it was 27% lower than the number from September 5 years ago. But mind you, 5 years ago, our population was about 1.5 million less than it is right now. We don't have enough properties on sale for all the people who want to buy it. And this is why, even though when we are seeing a distress sale, people are not having to fire sell their properties because there's not just one buyer for that particular property, there are multiple. And so even though the vendor might be okay to take a cheaper price to sell the property and relieve their mortgage stress, they are finding that buyers are competing with each other because of the low levels of properties available on the market. Reason number 4, we're not building enough properties. Check out this next chart. Here we have the dwelling completions versus population change from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian federal budget. And what we can see is there were only 174,400 dwellings built in Australia in the last financial year. But that's against a population increase of over 600,000 people. Now remember, the Albanese government said they were going to try and build 1.2 million homes in 5 years, right? Now that means that's an average of 240,000 homes to be built, and they only built 170,000. So we're about 70,000 below target. That's not a small number. And then if we look at the dwelling approvals for September, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it paints a stark picture. It shows that the number of properties we're building are actually set to fall while our population is increasing. Dwelling approvals fell by 4.6% over the month to 13,144 in September, with the level of approvals around decade lows. So what that shows you is that at a time when our population is growing faster than it ever has in our history, we're actually building fewer and fewer homes. The gap between demand and supply is only starting to get bigger and bigger, and that's going to continue to put upwards pressure on property prices, not everywhere, but where supply shortages are the biggest. And finally, and this is the biggest reason of all, is that we are now about to go into the silly season, Christmas. People then get to the end of the year and then they're going to start reflecting on their plans for the new year. And there's a lot more buyer confidence going into January 2024 than there was in January 2023. Remember the headlines that I showed you at the start, what we were seeing, what the messages were in the media when we started this year. But now the messages we're seeing in the media are very, very different. Now people in fact are starting to see that, property prices have actually risen at a time when interest rates are at the highest they've ever been. There's a lot more confidence in the property market. And so there are people who are going to say, well, look, if we're going to make a move, if we're going to upsize, if we're going to buy that first home, now is the time to do so. There is no point waiting. Property prices are going to keep rising. And that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. More and more people enter the market to buy. There's going to be more and more sales activity. We don't already have enough supply. Enter all these new buyers, and that will only put more upwards pressure on property prices. And then if we look at then what interest rates are set to do, in the short term, we may see one more rise. But I truly believe that in 2024, we are going to see rates start to fall. And that means that there are so many people who are sitting on the sidelines right now who want to buy their first property, who want to buy an investment property, and they can't because their borrowing capacities aren't high enough, when interest rates fall, their borrowing capacity will increase and they will also enter the market, furthering demand. Demand will continue to remain higher than supply, and you're going to see property prices increase in multiple areas around the country. And that's why I'm saying that the property boom is set to begin in a few weeks. I think you'll see it start in the first quarter of 2024. So many people jumping into the market, and I believe that in multiple markets around the country, 2024 will be a bigger boom year than 2021 was. Yes, I'm expecting the next property boom to be bigger than the post-COVID boom, driven primarily by the massive migration we have in this country, fueling demand, not enough supply, and we all want a place to live. It means that house prices can only go one way in many areas, and so that's why I'm saying the property boom is just a few weeks away. And if you want to know how to take advantage of that boom so that you don't miss out, click the link in the description to get totally for free the digital version and audio version of my book. Otherwise, I really hope that if you can afford to, you jump in, do your due diligence, and buy a great quality investment property that catapults you towards achieving your financial goals. Good luck.